This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, a podcast bringing you timely interviews with industry experts from pharma, biotech, medical devices, and life science manufacturing. Each week, we discuss trending topics and industry best practices. This week, we are pleased to have with us two guests, John Patterson, who's Senior Consultant, and Chris Wubbolt, Principal at QACV Consulting. Welcome, John and Chris.
Glad to be here, Stacey. How are you today?
I am very well, and I'm very excited to have you both here. We're talking this week about successful virtual audits during this time of COVID-19, but I guess it applies to any other time when you can't get in to do an actual audit. But obviously, we are seeing much increased incidence of this currently. And for our listeners, as you know, in life science and other regulated environments, audits are necessary to demonstrate compliance with regulations and to ensure the quality of products. Regulated companies may be busy creating medical devices and pharmaceuticals right now to combat the current COVID-19 virus, but even with social distancing, audits must be done. Like many other tasks, they're being done virtually. So John and Chris, did you ever factor in a global pandemic in your audit schedule? I guess that's the big question, because here we are.
Well, I think it's one of those things, Stacey, where the real world is stranger than fiction. I mean, who'd have ever imagined it? But at the same time, we all know, we watch the movies, we know this thing is theoretically possible. Now it's upon us, and I would say that, it's a surprise to everyone, but at the same time, we have seen similar issues in the past, 9/11 from 20 years ago, where we couldn't travel for a while. So, I think the idea of a remote audit, obviously, it has its place today, it's had its place for some time. But obviously, as you suggest, a lot more interest in needing to expand what was traditionally sort of more of something used on a risk-based approach, where you were using it for, vendors doing small things. You're now having to do it in order to maintain some continuity in your audit schedule. We're needing to do it for audits that we otherwise would have planned to physically go there.
Absolutely. Chris, anything to add?
Yeah, I as John indicated, I don't think anyone has anticipated this, although, again, we probably should have to some degree. We all have. One of the things we look at during audits actually is business continuity plans and contingency plans, and we do. It's very important. We talk about disasters and hurricanes and so forth, but pandemics, another reason why we need these types of plans, and now a lot of companies are implementing them, and part of that is this remote audit program as well.
Thank you. And so to both of you, what are the primary drivers then for determining remote audits? Obviously, in the midst of a pandemic, when you cannot be on site, there must be still some determining factors whether a remote audit will or will not work for a specific company.
Stacey, great question. And I think it really starts, and this has been in place for some time, using the risk-based approach for the audit process. And for example, sometimes it's not even necessary to have a direct online discussion, and a simple assessment, a paper audit or mail order audit, as they're often called, is more than sufficient, depending on the risk of what the supplier is providing.
Sure.
So I think, it's the risk-based approach that determines whether you can just have an assessment performed versus a true remote desktop audit where you have some sort of interaction like what we're having now, or a full-blown physical feet-on-the-ground audit.
And I think that some audits are definitely more, remote audits aren't for every type of audit. So, there's so much that can be gained from doing a tour of the manufacturing floor or the laboratory and so forth, then that's really difficult to do remotely. But some types of audits may not be quite as efficient conducting remotely. But there are other types of audits, software vendor audits, CRO audits, and other types of virtual audits that definitely can be done remotely. Many times, if you're doing a software vendor audit, for example, you if you're on site, many times the developers are in one country and the project managers are in another part of the state or another part of the country. So, and to some degree, all the audits that we do have some level of remote or virtual conduct that's completed. So, but not every audit is as effective. Definitely, again, the manufacturing audits, data integrity assessments to some degree, as well as some laboratory audits and so forth, or clinical site audits possibly as well.
Excellent. I think that's a great point that you made, Chris, because there are, even in our everyday life, when things are running normal and some of us are going into the office every day, there are still a number of employees who may work remotely and still be part of the team. So this is not, although this may be unusual to do the entire audit virtually, it seems like there already were pieces that were happening that way anyhow.
Definitely, for sure.
Yeah. Are there currently any regulatory guidances for virtual audits?
Yeah, there's actually some guidance out there from the World Health Organization, from PICS, the regulatory organization, also MHRA. There's various guidances around how to efficiently conduct and the purpose of using a virtual or overseas audit, as some of the documentation or some of these guidances are referred to. So yes, there is some guidance that is really around, when is it most appropriate? And I think they sort of are based off of the previous discussion we had around the risk-based approach, when it's appropriate to be able to do a desktop or virtual audit, versus, an audit that, boots on the ground kind of thing. I think the consideration these days is, and as Chris noted, sort of expanding on that concept of being able to do a little bit more and make a virtual audit, more extensive, more expansive. And we all know that for those of us, particularly for folks working in the computer validation or the looking at computerized systems, sometimes it's actually preferred to have a true virtual or full virtual audit, since you have people located all over the world, and you're going to want to have that aspect where multiple people around the world are interfacing at the same time on one computer screen, which actually I think a case can be made sometimes that that's probably the preferred way to do it, particularly for IT hosted platforms, systems that are virtual by their very nature.
Sure, and it seems like just by the fact that there are specific regulations in place already, they've thought of that, and that's something that was being anticipated well before this.
Yes, I would agree with that.
So what would you say are some practical considerations then for performing audits remotely that might have been initially planned as on-site audits or pieces to an on-site audit?
Yeah, I think this is where you kind of get back into basic meeting management, making sure that you have inclusive behavior for the audit process. So, making sure that, hey, if you're going to do a virtual audit, are all the audit deliverables viewable electronically? And did someone think of that before the audit started? So, is everything has it been scanned into PDF, or is there electronic files that need to be, viewed in their native format? So I think it's really around preparation and, having everybody before the audit starts to have that at least email communication or some pre-meetings just to make sure you can actually get at everything. I think there's some other practical things, does everyone have the right bandwidth? Are you going to be able to hear them? And then, another one is, and I think this kind of goes without saying, whether it's virtual or on the ground audit, is Have you considered language differences? Are you prepared to deal with translation and these sorts of things? So I don't think there's anything special. It's just that sometimes when you do a physical audit, you don't have to do as much planning because you know you're physically there, and you can always kind of go look at things. But obviously you have that limitation when you're doing it virtually.
Sure. Chris, anything to add?
Yeah, I think a lot of the success of remote audit also, it really comes down to cooperation and flexibility, because it depends on some of the tools that are available. I've done a lot of remote audits even before the COVID-19 crisis.
Right.
And I know one audit that I did where the auditee, they insisted on not setting up a repository, electronic repository. So if I wanted to review an SOP and read that SOP, it would be I'd have to ask them to scroll down or page down to the next page, and that's not really efficient for anybody,
right?
And not very effective either. And it was really not a very good experience. However, if there are a lot of tools out there that are available for loading documents in a secure manner so that they can be viewed but not downloaded or printed during an audit. So, setting up the typical audit schedule, an opening meeting, some introduction, some overview of processes and so forth, where you conduct that similarly to you would an on-site audit. And then at that point, take some time to review, make some document requests, but then take some time to review the SOPs or the deliverables, the reports, the protocols that have been set up and within the document repository, whatever the company may use or have, and then set up time periodically to allow for questions and with SMEs and so forth. So I try to, during a remote audit, handle those audits similarly to an on-site audit. But if you're going to have someone that's going to, if I'm on site and someone's turning the pages of an SOP for me while I'm reading it, then that's not very effective. So it really requires cooperation and flexibility, sometimes with time zones or different times also, or as well. But if both the auditor and the auditee have to be very flexible and really work together in a partnership in order to make this be successful.
It sounds like it. And it sounds like both of you are pointing to a need for preparation, ahead of time, and really considering all of the items that are going to go into it. And so just to dig a little bit deeper, when preparing for a remote or virtual audit, what tasks are you as the auditor performing ahead of time, prior to start? And what are you asking of the organizations or the auditees?
Yeah, I think, Stacey, I always like to make sure that, I've done basics around what's the previous regulatory history of the organization. And, they generally tell you things like that. But, through the FDA's website and various sources of information that are out there, you can gain a lot around how well have they been doing in their regulatory inspections, which I think is a really powerful indication and measure of, are they an organization that's really under control, or are they fighting some fires? So, that's one. You mentioned about, when you're remote, you lose some of the face-to-face kind of things. And I think it's coming up. I always try and come up with some questions that are probing in nature, open-ended in nature, that, help me gauge how is this organization performing? How knowledgeable is the person that is facing off with me in this audit? And so, I look at it as a job interview. And when I prepare, when I'm going to interview somebody for a job, I do a little bit of research. I try and make sure I've got relevant questions so that I can very quickly determine, is this an A plus player that we want to hire immediately, or hey, is this somebody that may have some issues that we got to start digging around in? So I would say that's probably the key. And I think it's like anything. The remote audit forces you to be a little more focused and in some ways maybe more effective, because, you don't have that luxury of being able to physically sit across from somebody and see their body language, as an example.
Of course. And in addition to doing your research as the auditor, are there specific types of documentation or things that you're asking of the auditee to bring to the table or to supply to you electronically prior to, the start of the meeting?
Sure. I mean, it's pretty standard audit type things. You want to see their, any sort of EIR reports. These are regulatory assessments from agencies like the FDA. You want them to provide things like, do they have ISO certifications? How are they? What standards are they currently using? Some sort of high level quality manual. They generally are providing you maybe not their complete set of quality management systems, but an overview, a list of procedures. These sorts of things that I think in a very short period of time you can get an idea of, are they going to be? Do they have the basic quality management mindset, and do they have that framework in place to assure that they're going to be meeting your expectations?
Of course. Chris, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I've actually found that, so we always do this during audits. We send out an audit confirmation letter, request of documents to be provided up front, and also documents to be delivered during the audit. What I've found is that in a remote audit, that many times some of the documents that we want to see while we're on site, that the auditee will actually already provide or upload into that secure repository, whatever they might be using. And so it actually gives, I've seen in some cases that the remote audits that the auditees have provided all their SOPs, again, in a secure manner. And I have to be even more specific in my request for documentation ahead of time. So I ask for that, for key deliverables or again, reports or specifications or protocols or plans, maybe some upfront requests for training records. And this actually, I've actually seen some of the auditees that I've been auditing more recently remotely. They've done a tremendous job just really providing that documentation even before the start of the official opening of the audit. So again, it all depends on the cooperation of the auditee. Some groups are not as comfortable with it. Some companies that you might audit are not as comfortable with remote audits, so they may be a little bit more restrictive in what they provide to you. But ultimately, you need that information during the audit. And a lot of the companies that I've done remote audits for, and I actually have to do an internal remote audit later today with a company in California, but they provided all their documentation that I need, that I've reviewed already prior to the opening meeting. So it actually, in some cases, you can prepare better if the audit is suitable to be done remotely. Again, some audits are definitely better suited to be done on site, but some of these organizations are really preparing and making the audit more efficient just by providing this information up front, when typically in the past for an on-site audit, it might just be available when you come to that facility.
Well, I'm glad to hear that it's working so well. And it sounds like the process is pretty much the same, whether you're there in front of them in person or whether you're doing a virtual audit, in terms of what you're asking for and what you're reviewing.
That's correct.
So as we've talked already a little bit about some of the disadvantages to remote audits, including limited ability to visualize the facility or, to look specifically at equipment, sometimes reviewing processes, and perhaps even, a decreased capability in reading body language in real time as you're asking specific questions. How are you both overcoming these kinds of obstacles? What, any little tips or things that typically, work well to get the best overall view of the auditee?
Stacey, I think one of the key ones, and you alluded to it, is body language. Depending on what psychiatrist or psychologist you listen to, as much as 90% of information is communicated non-verbally. So
right.
I think starting with insisting on, if the technology is available, to have video. I think that matters and helps. I'm working on a remote audit right now where we're going to be doing things like we're going to take an iPhone and we're going to go look at equipment. and I want to go look at a specific piece of equipment because I want to see the calibration tag. So I think there's some things there that, kind of, adversity leads to opportunity kind of thinking, where stuff we all always knew was possible. Now we can actually, we need to make it work, because we do need to replace a physical on the boots audit in a place that we were planning on going, and we can't go there. So I think it's just a matter of kind of thinking about how you would have done it on if you were physically there, and assuming that the technology can support it, like an iPhone, show me a tank calibration tag number, that's possible. Now that has technical limitations, obviously. Sometimes, you might not be able to take the phones everywhere. There may not be sufficient bandwidth, et cetera. But, I think these are the sorts of things that I've been trying to focus as we have some situations where they were originally planned physical, and now we got to do it virtual.
Sure. Chris, anything else?
No, that's a good point regarding the iPhone for FaceTime, or I don't have an iPhone, so we'd have to use another solution, of course. But using that tech process, that's possible if the people that you're auditing are actually on site also, because a lot of the people at these companies are now working remotely as well. Hopefully some of the manufacturing facilities, they have people on site and they're not shut down completely. But I think that's definitely, you have to take innovative approaches, just like we're doing right now with our lives and how we get groceries and how we get gasoline and deliveries and so forth. So we're all adjusting, and we have to really think about how we can be efficient at conducting these types of audits. Sure. And a lot of companies are doing those things, so they're making that available so that we're able to continue to support the various projects that we're all involved in and so forth.
I'm just curious, in a follow-up to this, if you're on site and you're looking somebody in the eye and you're asking them for specific documentation or to see a specific piece of equipment, they kind of have to comply immediately in real time. Is it the same with a remote audit, or is there the opportunity for them to kind of drag that out, get back to you with something? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think this really gets back to what you've set up as the ground rules for the audit. And what I try to do in my virtual audits, I've always tried to make it as real time as possible, because I want to see, for example, if I ask for training records, can you really get those training records to me in a reasonable amount of time, or
Precisely.
Something that is problematic? So yeah, I think this goes back to is the expectation that they're going to be providing this documentation immediately, and I think that goes back to the pre-planning, and Chris alluded to it. The notification letter that you've specified what documents you want. I think that's where, if you are going to be doing this fully virtual, you're going to want to say you expect that, we're going to have a real FaceTime discussion, and that you're going to provide additional questions as you would expect in a normal boots on the ground type of audit.
Right. So nothing should come as a surprise to anyone.
That's right.
I have actually seen some delays in that capacity. So QA, for example, they may be hosting the audit, and even with the pre-planning and pre-document requests that have been provided, you may ask for a document to the QA host, and so day one of the audit, and then afterward, you make the request, and they say, "Oh, we can get that for you, but it's actually on site. It's a paper record." So we have to get someone to, on site to find that record, to scan it, to upload it. And I have seen some delays in that area. And prior to any remote audit, I actually do make the statement that I understand that those things can occur, and that we if we need to, if it's a 2-day audit or a 3-day audit, we may need to have some follow-ups that occur on day 4 or day 5 or the following week, depending upon how long it takes for some of the deliverables or documentation requests to be provided. So, and I think for the most part, that companies have been reasonable in those requests, and that's only happened 2 or 3 times when we've had some follow-up discussions that have gone past that defined 2 or 3 day time period for the remote audit to be conducted. But I have seen some delays in that area because of, if it's a paper record in particular, it's not always available and requires some intervention by somebody that's near those records or on site to provide that to the QA host.
Right. And that can be even more difficult right now where most people are not on site. They're working remotely.
That's correct.
So almost every highly regulated organization has been adversely affected by this COVID-19 pandemic. Unfortunately, we've seen the vulnerability in the global supply chain and the lack of emphasis placed on contingency planning. And I'm just wondering, do you both feel these experiences that we've had to date and will still have will or maybe should lead to additions of remote audits and other contingency items into organizations' SOPs or best practice procedures? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, using an old phrase, that which does not kill you will make you stronger. I think everybody's learning from this experience. And for those of us that are out auditing, I mean, this is the perfect time to throw the question out, hey, do you actually have a contingency plan for this type of incident? And for the folks that I've been auditing, I think most of them have had satisfactory plans for exactly this type of event. So I think, this is where, you kind of harken back to just good old fashioned school of common sense. And yes, I mean, if you haven't been doing appropriate disaster recovery planning or contingency planning, then I think, you may have trouble existing as a business after this. So I think there is going to be a natural sort of process that comes out of this. And yeah, I think people are now going to take this stuff much more seriously in the future, which will hopefully prevent it from never happening again in our lifetimes.
I hope so. Insurance is the best deterrent sometimes.
That's right.
Chris, anything additional that you want to add there?
Yeah, I think that more broadly, I believe that companies will reevaluate their supply chains and some of the key components or medicines or PPEs and so forth that are being manufactured in faraway places that they may need to have some additional capacity, more local to the various countries. So I think that will that will definitely open up some additional opportunities in the United States or maybe Europe, where in the past some of that manufacturing might have gone overseas because of primarily because of costs, and so this that's fine when all is well and good and everyone's walking around without masks and so forth, but when you do have the situation like this, I think there will be some reevaluation of those supply chains for critical materials and PPEs that protect the people that are protecting us and the healthcare workers and so forth in hospitals and doctors' offices and things like that. So I think we definitely that will definitely be looked at, hopefully at least.
Right. I agree. And I think, there's a recent bill that was passed, the Medical Supply Chain Security Act, which I understand was already in place for pharmaceuticals, drugs, but they just extended that to include all medical supplies. And they're expecting manufacturers to report to the FDA potential shortages or breaks in the supply chain. And I from what I understand, that the FDA is going to then take that information and look at finding suppliers and supplies closer to home, and it's going to give them hopefully an opportunity to sort of bring some of the control back for our own medical supplies back to the U.S. So we'll see how that rolls out.
Yeah, and Stacey, I think you have that right, and the FDA will do as they always do, an excellent job of enforcing the law.
Right.
And now that law has been clarified around more than just some pharmaceutical products, I think there will be more focus on ensuring that if there are future events like this and supply chains do get temporarily broken, that it doesn't impact the ability for the country to respond to this type of issue. So yeah, as always, I'm confident the FDA will do an excellent job at their job.
I agree. And I think that they have been moving swiftly in terms of the temporary, the temporary things that they've been putting out to allow for compounding of drugs that are not readily available, and for suppliers who don't typically manufacture masks and sanitizers and stuff to do so. So I think that they have been flexible, and hopefully that we are using this all as a learning experience, going forward. So back to remote audits, for our listeners, what tips on platforms or other tools that deliver the best virtual audit experience can you give to our listeners? I want them to really understand some of the best things out there that you guys are using currently.
Yeah, I think a couple of points here, and I'll try to be very not too many details, but the one that we found that's critical is that when you have a virtual meeting, make sure you have a phone call-in number as well. And the reason being that the IP telephony, the audio through the computer, although sometimes is fabulous and everybody's perfect, generally you have people that either can or can't get access. And so that's where that phone connection, the ability to have somebody call in on the phone, at least for temporary periods of time, I think is absolutely essential. We found it to be something that in order to do it right, in order to have that capability, let's make sure you got a phone call-in capability as well. So, as far as specific platforms, we have Microsoft Office, so we use the Office 365 platform, and with that, you get the MS Teams, Microsoft Teams, which is the modern version or the upgraded version of Skype. Skype's okay, but I think Microsoft Teams is better. I think in the Google world, Google Hangouts is really good. They have that capability, as I mentioned, to have call-in as well. And then there's, platforms like Zoom.
Right.
Zoom's an interesting one. I would recommend that if you're doing some intense audits, make sure you have your security folks check that they've looked at the recent security exploit problems that Zoom has. And this gets into
we've all heard about them.
Yeah, and I think it's something where just make sure that your security team, somebody addresses and assures you that that's not an issue. And then, of course, there's a myriad of other tools that are out there. And, it's the kind of thing you get what you pay for. There's WebEx, there's various ones. And I think, it really, I'm sure there's ones that you can pay a whole lot of money for that have all kinds of capability. But, if you can rely on some of these more standard ones, especially Teams and Google Hangouts, that's probably where you want to be focused on.
Sure. Chris, any other tools that are working well for you?
Well, I've seen Teams also has the ability to share documents, and there's other tools as well, Box, Dropbox, Interlinks, and I've used all of those on remote audits. Typically, the auditee will set that up so they have more control over the repository, but they all seem to work, and they all have some capabilities to secure the documents. So many times, documents are proprietary, so they can be viewed during an audit, but they can't be downloaded or saved. And some of the tools that I mentioned have that capability to prevent downloading or printing of those documents as well.
Oh, great. Yeah, great point.
So that's important, I think. And, nobody wants to be, I always call it audit etiquette. So nobody wants to take SOPs that are proprietary. If there's a document that's specific to a project that is available for the auditee, the auditor, definitely that's provided and that's acceptable. But we all want to make sure we follow audit etiquette and have the documents available for us, either for review or possibly in some cases to maintain as part of the audit record. But we all want to make sure that the companies that are involved in this feel comfortable that they're not losing their proprietary information as well when these audits are being conducted.
Right. Secure data security obviously is just as important as it always has been. And then making sure the platforms that you're using can meet those demands would be important for sure. Wow, some great information, gentlemen, this morning. I really appreciate you spending time with us. Before we close, I just wanted to see if there's any other tips or advice that you'd like to give to our audience, either on the remote audit specifically or pieces of what you're doing during this uncertain times here, during these uncertain times.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, and just to reemphasize an earlier point, is what I would term inclusive behavior that you use in the audit process. I mean, little things like knowing and being able to refer people by their first name when you address them, that you know who's in the call. And I think those kinds of etiquette can really help to ensure that there's the trust and the collaboration, as Chris was pointing out earlier, making that whole collaborative process work better. Because I think as the auditor, you're going to be kind of driving that. And I think in a remote audit, you have to be a little more of a facilitator, as opposed to when you're boots on the ground across from somebody, you can kind of be more the, you can take a different tone, but you can lose that when you don't have that ability to be physically there. So I think, again, inclusive behavior, and there's various forms of that. There's people that teach that as a way of doing business. That's the thing that I would encourage.
Excellent. That's a really great point, John. Thank you. Chris, anything else?
Yeah, I think along with any audit, just proper planning, plan, and in terms of that not only that audit confirmation letter and the pre-request for documents so that the auditee can prepare, but set up a pre-audit call with the auditee, not only to discuss the audit, but discuss the logistics of the audit in terms of the expectations of how long during the audit do people need to be available. How will documents be shared and so forth. Make sure that that's all discussed and planned and prepared, and I think that will help the audit to be successful.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. I really appreciate you taking time this morning, John and Chris, to be here and to help our audience better understand how the remote audits are going. I think this is something that will continue to see a lot of, even post-pandemic. So it's good to really dig in, know what it's all about, and then auditees can sort of plan for this in their SOPs or whatever for future times as well. So anyway, thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate it. I want to also say thank you to our producer, Ben Kitchen, and Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. And I also want to give a big shout out to you, all our valued listeners. We appreciate you sticking with us. Even in these uncertain times, we are working hard to bring you the most timely information and interviews. If you like Voices in Validation, we encourage you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice so you never miss an episode. And also, we'll ask you to share with your colleagues and online networks. That's how we grow. For more information on this podcast and links from today's show, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with more great interviews. Until then, stay safe and make it a great week.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.